Ma'am, we've had multiple noise complaints from this address.
That's not possible. My home has been quiet.
Ma'am, don't argue with me. This address was reported.
Who made the complaint?
That information is none of your business.
You do not have permission to enter.
Step back right now. You're being uncooperative. Stop!
The concept of sanctuary is ancient, predating our modern laws and statutes. It is the primal understanding that a person's home is their fortress, a sovereign territory where the chaos of the outside world is held at bay by a simple wooden door and a turning lock. For Judge Rebecca Lawson, silence was not merely an absence of sound. It was a tangible asset, a necessary currency for a mind that spent its days weighing the heavy, clamorous sins of others. The evening of October 14th was defined by this specific curated silence. The time was exactly 7:32 p.m. The air inside the residence at Millbrook Heights smelled of lemon polish and old paper, the scent of a meticulously kept life. Outside, the suburban street was swallowed by the indigo quiet of autumn, but inside, the only sound was the faint, mathematical precision of a Bach cello suite drifting from the study. Rebecca sat in her leather wingback chair, reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, her husband away on business, her children grown and gone. She was alone with the law, reviewing case files for the morning docket. There was no party. There were no shouting voices. There was only the rhythmic turning of pages and the soft hum of the HVAC system. Then, the chime cut through the house. It was a jarring electronic intrusion that severed the peace. Rebecca did not jump, for she was a woman not easily startled, but she paused, her hand hovering over a file on racketeering. She checked the time, 7:32 p.m. An unannounced visitor in this neighborhood, at this hour, was an anomaly. She set her glasses on the mahogany side table, the click of the frames against the wood sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. She walked to the foyer, her heels making no sound on the plush runner. The house felt vast around her, a testament to a career built on 15 years of unassailable integrity. When she reached the heavy oak front door, she did not open it immediately. Years as a prosecutor before ascending to the bench had instilled in her a reflex of caution. She leaned in, closing one eye, and pressed her face to the brass peephole. The fisheye lens distorted the world outside, bending the porch pillars and curving the horizon. But the image was unmistakable. Two figures. The harsh blue-white glare of the LED porch light reflected off the metallic pinned badges on their chests. Police. Her heart rate did not spike. Innocence is a powerful sedative, but a frown creased her forehead. She unlocked the deadbolt, the heavy tumble of steel sounding like a gunshot in the quiet foyer. But she left the chain latch engaged. She cracked the door 3 inches. The night air that rushed in was crisp and smelled of damp leaves. Through the narrow gap, the dynamic of the porch was immediately clear. The older officer, a man with the thick neck and graying temples of a veteran who believes he has seen everything, stood too close to the door. This was Sergeant David Kane. His stance was not one of inquiry, it was one of aggression. Behind him, a younger female officer, hair pulled back tight, scanned the darkness of the yard, her hand resting near her belt. Rebecca spoke first, her voice calm, inquiring how she could help them. The sergeant did not offer a polite greeting. He did not apologize for the disturbance. Instead, he launched an accusation that collided violently with the reality of the last 3 hours. He claimed they were responding to multiple noise complaints. He stated, with the flat affect of a man reciting a script he had already decided was true, that the neighborhood had reported loud music and shouting coming from this specific address. Rebecca stared at him, blinking slowly. The absurdity of the statement was almost disorienting. Behind her, the house was a tomb of silence. The box suite had ended, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator. She informed the officer, with the precise diction of a jurist, that there must be a mistake. She explained that she had been reading alone, in silence, all evening. Caney did not blink. He looked at his clipboard, then back at her, his eyes hard and unyielding. He confirmed the address. He insisted the complaints were verified. A cold prickle of warning moved down Rebecca's spine. This was not a misunderstanding. She had presided over thousands of cases. She knew the texture of a lie. She knew the specific frequency of a power trip. She asked, reasonably, which neighbors had complained, offering to call them right then and there to clear up the confusion. The sergeant's demeanor shifted from bureaucratic to menacing. He rejected her logic. He told her that her cooperation was the only thing required, not her questions. He demanded entry. He stated they needed to come inside to investigate the source of the noise, a noise that manifestly did not exist. This was the pivot point. This was the moment where the interaction ceased to be a civil service and became a hunt. Rebecca stood on the threshold of her home, a woman who knew the Fourth Amendment better than she knew the back of her own hand. She refused. She told them clearly that, without a warrant, and given the complete absence of probable cause, they were not crossing her threshold. She moved to close the door. It was a slow-motion violation. Sergeant Caney did not step back. He did not respect the boundary of the citizen or the sanctity of the home. He thrust a heavy black combat boot into the gap between the door and the frame. The wood groaned. The chain latch pulled taut, the metal straining against its screws. Rebecca looked down at the boot invading her home, then up into the eyes of a man who had no idea who she was, or what kind of storm he was about to summon. She demanded he remove his foot. She ordered him to step back. But the sergeant wasn't listening to the law. He was listening to his own adrenaline. He shoved his weight against the wood. The chain snapped with a sharp, violent crack that echoed like a pistol shot, the metal flying across the foyer floor. The door swung wide open, exposing the sanctuary of Judge Rebecca Lawson to the night, and to the wolves standing on her porch. High in the corner of the entryway, a small dark lens blinked silently, recording every frame of the nightmare that had just walked in. The silence was over. The war had begun. The sound of the chain latch snapping was the sound of the Constitution breaking in a suburban foyer. It was a sharp metallic ping that signaled the end of civil discourse and the beginning of a felony. Sergeant David Caney did not just step into the house. He invaded it. He brought the humidity of the night and the aggressive posture of the street into the climate-controlled sanctity of a woman's private library. Officer Lisa Rodriguez followed in his wake, a silent accomplice crossing a threshold that should have been inviolable. For a moment, the silence was absolute. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a predator assessing its environment. Rebecca Lawson stood her ground. She did not scream. She did not cower. She was a woman who would stare down cartel lieutenants and corrupt politicians from the bench. And she recognized the specific jagged energy of a bully with a badge. But she also knew the geometry of the trap that had just been sprung. High in the corner, the red LED of the security camera pulsed, a silent, unblinking witness to the violation. Caney demanded identification. The request was a weapon, not an inquiry. He was demanding papers from a woman standing in her own living room, surrounded by her own books, wearing her own reading glasses. It was a power play designed to humiliate, to transform a homeowner into a suspect. Rebecca understood the game. She moved with the deliberate, glacial calm of someone who knows the law better than the person enforcing it. She retrieved her driver's license. She held it out. The plastic card was a testament to reality. It listed her name. It listed the very address where they were standing. It was irrefutable proof of residency. Caney held it for a long, uncomfortable minute. He was looking for a flaw, a crack, a reason to escalate. Finding none, he handed it back and asked the question that would seal his fate. He asked what she did for a living. Rebecca answered him. She told him the truth. She told him she was a circuit court judge. The words should have stopped the world. They should have been a splash of cold water, a realization of a catastrophic error. Officer Rodriguez flinched. You could see the physical recoil in her shoulders, the sudden dawning horror that they had just kicked in the door of a high-ranking judicial official. But Sergeant Caney did not flinch. His ego was a runaway train, and it had too much momentum to stop for something as inconvenient as the truth. He laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. He told her he didn't believe her. He told her anyone could claim to be a judge. The air in the room grew toxic. Rodriguez began to wander, her eyes scanning the room, touching Rebecca's personal belongings with a visual entitlement that was a Fourth Amendment violation in itself. She was searching without a warrant, looking for anything to justify their intrusion. A bottle of pills, a weapon, a sign of disorder. There was nothing. Only the immaculate order of a legal mind. Rebecca reached her limit. She walked to her study, her movements sharp and precise. She returned with the gold standard of identity, her judicial badge and her official business cards. The badge was heavy, encased in leather, issued by the state court administration. It carried the weight of the government. She presented it to Caney. He held the badge. He looked at the raised lettering. He looked at the seal of the state. This was the off-ramp. This was the moment where he could have apologized, backed away, and prayed for mercy. The universe offered him a chance to retreat. But Caney looked at the badge, and then he looked at Rebecca, and he made a choice that defied logic. He claimed it could be fake. He claimed that in this era of technology, anyone could forge a badge. It was a desperate, flailing lie, the logic of a man who had decided that his authority was the only truth that mattered. He was no longer policing, he was hunting. Rebecca's voice dropped an octave. It became the voice that sentenced men to life in prison. She told them they were trespassing. She told them they were violating federal law. She reached for her phone to call the chief of police. That was the trigger. Caney could not allow her to make that call. He announced she was under arrest for obstruction of justice. The absurdity of the charge was suffocating. Obstruction of what? Obstruction of an illegal entry based on a fabricated noise complaint? But the logic didn't matter. The handcuffs came out. The cold, ratcheting sound of the metal teeth clicking together was captured by the high-definition audio of the security system. Caney grabbed the wrists of a sitting judge, wrists that had signed hundreds of warrants, wrists that pounded the gavel of justice, and he twisted them behind her back. He tightened the metal until it bit into the skin. He was physically restraining the embodiment of the law. Rebecca did not fight. She knew that any physical resistance would be used to justify violence. She simply stated, for the record, for the camera, and for the federal lawsuit that was already forming in her mind, that she did not consent. She stated her title again. She stated the illegality of the act. Her words were calm, terrifyingly lucid, spoken not to the officers, but to the future jury. They marched her out of her own front door. The cool evening air hit her face, but it brought no relief. The neighborhood had awakened. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car fractured the darkness, painting the suburban lawns in a strobe of emergency. Neighbors were emerging, Mrs. Henderson from next door, Mr. Chen from across the street. These were people who had known Rebecca for a decade. They saw their neighbor, the pillar of the community, the woman who hosted the block parties, being led away in handcuffs like a common criminal. The shock was palpable. Phones were raised. The digital eyes of the community joined the surveillance. Caney barked at them to step back, to disperse. He was trying to control the narrative, but he had already lost control of reality. He shoved Rebecca toward the back of the patrol car. He placed his hand on top of her head, that patronizing gesture of police procedure, and forced her into the cramped, hard plastic seat of the cruiser. As the door slammed shut, sealing her inside the cage, Rebecca looked through the wire mesh. She saw Caney and Rodriguez standing under the porch light, their silhouettes distinct against the house they had just violated. They looked like conquerors. They looked like they had won. They had no idea that they were already dead men walking. They had no idea that the camera in the foyer was still recording, that the neighbors were streaming live video to the internet, and that the woman in the back of their car was not a victim, but a storm that was about to level their entire department. The car put into gear, and the long drive to the station began. A journey that would take them from the height of arrogance to the absolute bottom of ruin. The conflict was over. The war was just beginning. The interior of a police cruiser is a unique acoustic environment. It is a space designed for domination, a cage of hard plastic and wire mesh where the air always smells of stale adrenaline, industrial disinfectant, and the lingering sweat of 1,000 bad decisions. For most people, being sealed in that back seat triggers a primal fight-or-flight panic. But Judge Rebecca Lawson was not most people. As the cruiser rolled through the darkened streets of Millbrook Heights, the dashboard camera captured a scene that would be studied in law schools for generations. She sat with a posture that defied the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She did not scream. She did not plead. She began to lecture. In a low, steady voice, she dismantled their legal standing with the dispassionate efficiency of a surgeon. She explained the federal statutes regarding false arrest. She cited the specific case law concerning qualified immunity and its limitations. She spoke to the back of Sergeant Caney's head, detailing the exact sequence of events that would follow their arrival at the station. She told them they were driving toward their own professional funerals. Caney turned up the radio. He dismissed her words as the ramblings of a belligerent woman, a common tactic to drown out the voice of conscience. But beside him, Officer Rodriguez was silent. The dashboard camera caught her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, then to Caney, then back to the road. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, replaced by a cold, creeping nausea. She had seen the quality of the furniture in that house. She had heard the cadence of the woman's voice. A terrible question was beginning to bloom in her mind. What if the prisoner was telling the truth? The cruiser pulled into the precinct bay, the tires squealing against the polished concrete. They hauled Rebecca out, marching her through the heavy steel doors and into the harsh, humming, fluorescent glare of the booking area. This is where the atmosphere shifted from predatory to catastrophic. The booking desk is the nerve center of any precinct, a place where the chaotic reality of the street meets the rigid order of bureaucracy. Behind the high counter sat Desk Sergeant Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran with tired eyes and a memory like a steel trap. He glanced up from his paperwork, expecting another drunk and disorderly, another domestic dispute. He froze. The color drained from Torres's face so rapidly it looked as if he had been struck physically. He didn't look at Caney. He didn't look at Rodriguez. His eyes were locked on the woman in handcuffs. He had stood in her courtroom 3 days prior. He had testified before her in a felony assault case. He knew the terrifying intelligence that lived behind those eyes. He knew that the Honorable Rebecca Lawson did not suffer fools, and she certainly did not suffer false imprisonment. Torres stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor, a screech that cut through the ambient noise of the station. He bypassed protocol entirely. He leaned over the counter and hissed a question at Caney, asking if the sergeant had lost his mind. He didn't wait for an answer. He picked up the phone. The next 30 minutes were a study in administrative collapse. The booking process stopped. Caney, suddenly stripped of his swagger, was pulled into a glass-walled office where the mute shouting match that ensued was visible to everyone in the lobby. Rodriguez stood alone near the vending machines, looking like a ghost, watching her career dissolve in real time. Then came the suits. It started with the chief of police, rushing through the front doors with his tie undone, sleep still in his eyes. Then the mayor, then the district attorney. The lobby of the police station transformed into an emergency summit of the city's power brokers. They looked at the woman sitting calmly on the metal bench, still handcuffed, and they saw a political nuclear weapon counting down to 0. Chief Williams ordered the cuffs removed immediately. His apology was profound, breathless, and terrified. He tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a terrible error in judgment. He offered her water, offered her a private office, offered her anything that might stop the bleeding. But Rebecca Lawson remained seated. She rubbed her wrists where the steel had bitten the skin. She looked at the chief, then at the mayor, and asked a single question that sucked the oxygen out of the room. She demanded to see the noise complaint. The chief turned to his computer. He typed in the address. He searched the dispatch logs. He filtered by time, by caller, by zone. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. There was no log. There was no call. No neighbor had dialed 911. There was no record of a disturbance. The screen stared back at them, blank and accusing. The narrative of a mistake evaporated instantly. This wasn't an error, it was a fabrication. Caney and Rodriguez hadn't responded to a call. They had gone hunting. They had targeted a private residence, manufactured a pretext, and violated the Fourth Amendment rights of a sitting circuit court judge because they didn't like the color of her skin or the zip code on her mailbox. But the true pivot, the moment that turned the night from a scandal into a tragedy for the department, came when Rebecca finally spoke to the chief in private. Her attorney, the formidable David Brennan, had arrived, standing beside her like a sentinel. Rebecca revealed that she didn't just know Caney's name from the badge on his chest. She opened her briefcase, which had been retrieved from the scene, and pulled out a file. For 6 months, complaints had been crossing her desk. Affidavits from citizens, doctors, teachers, business owners, who looked like her and lived in neighborhoods like hers. They told stories of phantom traffic stops, of aggressive searches without warrants, of harassment masked as police work. She had recognized the names on the reports. She had been building a pattern. She had been quietly, methodically preparing to bring the hammer down on a corruption ring operating within this very precinct. Caney hadn't just arrested a judge. He had arrested the very investigator who was already building the case against him. He had walked into the lion's den, poked the sleeping beast, and then handed her the keys to his own destruction. The chief looked at the file. He looked at the blank dispatch log. He looked at the surveillance footage from the station lobby where his officers were now pacing like trapped animals. He realized then that this wasn't going to be a disciplinary hearing. This wasn't going to be a suspension. This was going to be a federal indictment. Rebecca stood up. She was no longer the prisoner. She was the law. And as she looked through the glass partition at Sergeant Caney, who was now realizing that no union rep could save him from what was coming, she didn't smile. Justice, she knew, wasn't about happiness. It was about balance. And the scales were about to crash down with the weight of a ruined life. The pivot was complete. The legal war was about to begin. The wheels of justice are famous for their slow, agonizing grind. But when a federal circuit court judge is shackled in her own foyer, those gears are suddenly greased with high-octane fury. What usually takes years was compressed into a matter of weeks. The local police department, once a fortress of blue silence, found itself besieged by an alphabet soup of federal agencies. The FBI didn't just knock. They executed search warrants with the same aggressive precision Sergeant Caney had used on Rebecca's front door. But this time, the warrants were real, the probable cause was ironclad, and the targets were the ones wearing the badges. When investigators cracked open the digital lives of Sergeant Caney and Officer Rodriguez, they didn't find a few bad apples. They found a rotten orchard. The forensic analysis of Caney's hard drive revealed something far more chilling than simple incompetence. It was a dossier of success. He had maintained detailed files on over 60 prominent African-American residents. These weren't criminal profiles, they were threat assessments. But the threat wasn't violence or drugs, the threat was status. The files contained photographs of luxury cars, property tax records of upscale homes, and surveillance notes on daily routines. The contents of these files turned the courtroom into a theater of collective shame. The jury listened to the story of Dr. Michael Franklin, a cardiovascular surgeon whose hands had saved hundreds of lives. They learned how he had been pulled over 11 times in 2 years, forced to stand spread-eagled on the asphalt in his scrubs while Caney tore apart his vehicle, searching for non-existent contraband. The jurors had to sit with the image of a surgeon, desperate to reach the operating table to save a dying patient, being detained because his car was too nice for the officer's liking. Then there was Sarah Washington, a real estate developer whose business had been bled dry by fraudulent investigations triggered by Caney's phantom tips. The court heard how millions of dollars in contracts evaporated, how employees were laid off, and how a community builder was systematically dismantled by a man who viewed her ambition as an affront to his authority. This wasn't policing, it was economic warfare waged from a patrol car. But the most damning evidence wasn't the financial ruin or the psychological trauma, it was the text messages. In the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the federal courtroom, the prosecution displayed the group chat logs on massive screens. The defense attorney, a man named Kessler, who looked as if he was trying to hold back a landslide with a spoon, had tried to argue that his client was merely overzealous. The text messages obliterated that defense. The jury read the casual cruelty, the racial slurs tossed around like locker room banter, the celebratory emojis used when they successfully humiliated a target. They saw the message where Caney bragged about making the surgeon late, joking about the power he held over life and death. And they saw the premeditation regarding Rebecca herself. Messages sent weeks before the incident, marking her as an uppity problem that needed to be solved. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Rebecca Lawson did not hide. She refused to step down from her own bench during the trial. She continued to preside over her cases, surrounded by U.S. Marshals, a living, breathing monument to the resilience of the law. Her presence in the courthouse was a silent rebuke to the men on trial. Every time the jury looked at the defense table, they saw the smallness of the men sitting there. Then they looked at the bench where Rebecca sat, and they saw the magnitude of the institution those men had tried to desecrate. The climax of the legal war came when the prosecution played the security footage. It is one thing to hear testimony, it is another to see the crime unfold in high definition. The courtroom watched the timestamp tick by. They heard the classical music playing softly in Rebecca's study. They saw the peaceful sanctity of a woman's home, and then the violence, the foot in the door, the sneer on Kane's face when he realized she was educated, the absolute refusal to look at the identification she offered. The audio captured the moment the handcuffs clicked, a sound that echoed in the courtroom like a gunshot. It was the sound of a career ending. Caney sat at the defense table, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed him. He wasn't looking at the jury. He was staring at the screen, watching himself destroy his own life. He was watching the moment his arrogance wrote a check his badge couldn't cash. Officer Rodriguez, who had turned state's witness to salvage what was left of her future, wept quietly as she detailed the inner workings of the conspiracy. She described a culture where harassment was a sport, and civil rights were a suggestion. Her testimony stripped away the last vestige of the blue wall. There was no brotherhood here, only a criminal conspiracy masquerading as law enforcement. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. In a federal conspiracy trial of this complexity, such speed is a message in itself. It is a rejection of the defense so complete it borders on insult. When the foreman stood to read the verdict, the air in the room felt thin, charged with the electricity of imminent judgment. Guilty on all counts. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, false imprisonment, deprivation of rights under color of law. The sentence was not a slap on the wrist, it was a sledgehammer. Sergeant Caney was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. There is no parole in the federal system. He would enter a cell as a middle-aged man and leave it, if he survived, as an elderly relic of a bygone era. His pension was forfeited. His name was disgraced. The power he had weaponized against his community had been stripped from him, leaving him with nothing but a number and a cage. As the bailiffs moved to take him into custody, the dynamic in the room shifted one final time. The victims, the doctors, the teachers, the business owners stood up. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout, they simply watched. They watched the man who had haunted their rearview mirrors and their nightmares be placed in the same handcuffs he had used on them. It was a quiet, heavy victory. The legal war was over. The battlefield was cleared. But as Rebecca Lawson walked out of the courthouse into the blinding flash of cameras and the roar of a waiting world, she knew that the echo of this gavel would ring for generations. But even she couldn't predict the final, haunting thought that would settle over the city once the noise died down. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung open, and Judge Rebecca Lawson stepped out into the biting February wind. The roar that met her was not the chaotic shouting of a crime scene, but the sustained, thunderous applause of a community that had been holding its breath for years. Flashbulbs erupted like strobe lights, cutting through the gray afternoon, illuminating a woman who had refused to be a victim. But as she stood on those concrete steps, looking out at the sea of faces, the doctors, the teachers, the terrified teenagers who had grown into wary adults, she didn't smile. Victory in a courtroom does not undo the trauma of a home invasion sanctioned by the state. It simply balances the ledger. The aftermath of the verdict was not a gentle fading of light, but a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of local governance. The fall of Sergeant David Caney and Officer Lisa Rodriguez was merely the first domino. In the months that followed, the department was stripped down to the studs. Oversight committees, once toothless and ceremonial, were given subpoena power. Body cameras, previously fought against by the union as an invasion of privacy, became mandatory, non-negotiable extensions of the uniform. The digital eyes were always watching now. The era of the unverified police report, the era where an officer's word was treated as gospel truth against a citizen's desperate plea, began to atrophy. Rebecca returned to her bench, but she was changed. How could she not be? For the next decade, every time a defendant stood before her, flanked by officers, she looked harder. She read the probable cause affidavits with a skepticism born of visceral experience. She understood now, in a way no law school textbook could ever teach, how easily the narrative could be manipulated before it ever reached the courtroom. She became a guardian of the process, a jurist who knew that the sanctity of the law depended entirely on the integrity of its enforcers. When she finally retired, 10 years later, she left behind a legacy not defined by the convictions she handed down, but by the fairness she demanded. And what of the man who had placed his foot in her door? David Kane did not vanish into a myth. He vanished into a bureaucracy. Federal prison is a cold, sterile machine designed to strip a man of his identity, layer by layer. For 22 years, the man who had terrorized a community with his badge became inmate number 49201. He watched the world change through a television screen in a common room. He watched the seasons turn through a slit of reinforced glass. The arrogance that had fueled his reign in Millbrook Heights was slowly ground into dust by the relentless routine of head counts and lockdowns. There is a specific kind of hell reserved for a former police officer inside the general population of a federal penitentiary, a constant low-level hum of danger that never truly sleeps. When he was finally released, the world he stepped back into was unrecognizable. He was an old man now, his hair thinned to nothing, his posture slumped under the weight of 2 decades of irrelevance. There was no pension waiting for him. There were no friends on the force to slap him on the back. The neighborhood he had once patrolled like a feudal lord had moved on, thriving in a peace that his absence had made possible. He was a ghost in a city that had exorcised him long ago. He lived out his remaining years in a small, cramped apartment, subsisting on state aid, a forgotten relic of a corrupt past. The power he had craved, the authority he had abused, had been replaced by a crushing, silent anonymity. But as the story of the judge and the sergeant fades into the annals of legal history, one final, haunting thought remains suspended in the air, chilling the blood of anyone who truly understands the mechanics of that night. We celebrate the justice served, we marvel at the strength of Rebecca Lawson, we applaud the system for finally working. But we must ask ourselves the question that keeps the soul awake at 3 a.m. What if she hadn't been a judge? What if the woman behind that door at 7:32 p.m. had been a nurse, a kindergarten teacher, a mechanic? What if she hadn't known the specific statutes regarding warrants and probable cause? What if she hadn't had the financial means to install a high-definition security system with cloud storage? What if she hadn't possessed the personal cell phone number of a high-powered civil rights attorney? If Rebecca Lawson had been anyone else, the story would not have ended with a federal trial. It would have ended with a plea deal. It would have ended with a resisting arrest charge that ruined a career. It would have ended with the quiet, suffocating destruction of a life buried under a false police report that no one would have ever questioned. The system worked, yes, but it worked because the victim was a powerful, legally brilliant, and wealthy member of the judiciary. The terrifying reality is that Sergeant Caney didn't fall because he was corrupt. He fell because he chose the one victim who had the power to fight back. He picked the wrong house. So, as you lock your doors tonight and set your alarms, as you listen to the hum of your own quiet neighborhood, remember the threshold of authority. Remember that justice should be blind, but in the case of United States versus Kane, justice had to keep its eyes wide open just to survive. The victory was absolute, but the margin for error was non-existent. And in the silence of the suburbs, the echo of that doorbell still rings, a reminder of how thin the line truly is between the rule of law and the rule of force. Are we safe because the law protects us, or are we safe simply because we haven't been noticed? That is the question that lingers long after the screen goes black.